It was a quiet town, nestled between thick forests and rolling hills. Everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long. But there was one secret that nobody had expected to come to light until it was too late. Lila had always been a good girl, smart and caring. She lived with her mom, Clara, a woman who had a reputation for being a bit of a social climber. Clara always had big dreams for herself, and she wasn't above using whatever means necessary to achieve them. One day, Clara met Sheriff Mitchell, a man in his mid-40s who had recently moved to town. He was strong, confident, and liked by many. He promised Clara a better life if she helped him with certain personal matters. What Clara didn't know was that Sheriff Mitchell wasn't exactly the man he seemed to be. Beneath his polite smile and charming demeanor, he had a dark side. When Sheriff Mitchell suggested an open relationship with Clara, the idea sounded harmless enough. He was a man of power, after all, and she thought she could handle it. But things soon took a terrifying turn when he made a proposal that sent chills down Clara's spine. He wanted Lila, her 17-year-old daughter, to be his girlfriend. The sheriff didn't want to be alone in his affairs anymore, and he thought the young girl might be the perfect addition to his secret life. Clara hesitated at first. She didn't want to lose her daughter, but the promise of wealth, status, and the power that came with the sheriff's favor was tempting. Clara told herself that it was just a game, a harmless arrangement, but deep down she knew it wasn't. The sheriff was relentless. He was charming, convincing, and his influence over Clara grew stronger every day. Clara eventually gave in, believing it was the only way to secure a future for herself. She told Lila that she was doing this for their family's benefit. She said the sheriff was a good man, but Lila didn't see it that way. Lila was horrified when her mother broke the news to her. She didn't understand why her mom would make such a terrible decision. But what could she do? Her mother had already made up her mind. Lila was trapped. For weeks, Lila was forced into the sheriff's presence. At first it was awkward, and she tried to avoid him, but the sheriff didn't take no for an answer. Slowly, his affection turned into something darker. He would push Lila, make her uncomfortable, all the while pretending it was a loving relationship. Lila began to feel trapped. She was alone, and nobody seemed to care about her well-being. Lila tried to reach out for help, but every time she spoke up, her mother would dismiss her concerns, telling her she was overreacting. It wasn't until the unthinkable happened that the situation escalated into something fatal. One cold evening, Lila was found dead in the woods, her body cold and lifeless, a cruel reminder of what could happen when people thought they could control others. The town was shocked, and whispers spread like wildfire. No one could believe that a young girl so full of life was gone. It was ruled an accident at first. The sheriff claimed it was a tragic case of her running away, getting lost in the woods, and suffering an unfortunate fall. But something didn't sit right with the investigator who was assigned to the case. Detective Brian Thomas had worked many cases over the years, and he was no stranger to the lies people told to cover up their actions. He wasn't going to let this one slide. As Detective Thomas examined the scene, he noticed something strange. There were no signs that Lila had wandered off, no footprints leading to the spot where her body had been found. It was as if she had been placed there. Detective Brian Thomas sat in his car, staring at the small, quiet town below him. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the death of Lila, the young girl who had been found in the woods just days ago. Everyone in town was shocked by her sudden death, but Detective Thomas had a feeling that this wasn't just an unfortunate accident. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many things that didn't add up. He parked his car in front of the small sheriff's station and walked inside. The faint smell of coffee and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. The sheriff's department was just like every other small-town office. Quiet, routine, and filled with people who had worked together for years. But Thomas didn't trust appearances. He had learned over the years that the most innocent-looking towns often hid the darkest secrets. Sheriff Mitchell was at his desk, going over paperwork when Thomas entered. The sheriff looked up, offering a polite smile. "Detective Thomas, what can I do for you?" he asked, his voice smooth and controlled. "I'm here to ask you about Lila's death," Thomas replied, keeping his tone neutral. "There are some things I need to clarify." The sheriff's expression shifted slightly, but only for a moment. He cleared his throat and motioned for Thomas to sit down. I've already given my statement to the authorities, detective. It was a tragic accident, nothing more to it. Thomas studied the sheriff carefully. He had heard the man's version of the story. Lila had gone into the woods alone, lost her footing, and fell to her death. The sheriff had claimed that she had run away after a fight with her mother, but there were too many inconsistencies in the story. Thomas wasn't buying it. I know you've given a statement, Sheriff, Thomas said, but there are a few things that don't add up. For one, there are no signs that Lila wandered off into the woods, no footprints, no evidence of her running or hiding. It's almost as if she was placed there. The sheriff's face tightened, but he quickly regained his composure. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. She was a troubled girl, detective. She had her own problems with her mother. It's not unheard of for a teenager to run off, especially after a fight. Thomas wasn't convinced. He had worked enough cases to know when someone was hiding something, and the sheriff's defensiveness only fueled his suspicions. And what about the bruises on her neck? Thomas pressed. The ones that weren't there when she was found, but were visible after the body was examined? The sheriff's expression faltered for a split second. I don't know anything about that, he stammered. I haven't seen anything like that. Thomas leaned forward, locking eyes with the sheriff. I think you do know something about it, Sheriff, and I think you're hiding something. The sheriff stood up, his posture rigid. This is absurd, he said, his voice rising. I've already cooperated with the investigation. I have nothing to hide. Thomas didn't respond. He had seen this reaction before. A person who was hiding something would often act indignant, even angry. He knew he had to dig deeper. He stood up, nodding slowly. I'll be following up with you, Sheriff. Don't leave town. As he walked out of the sheriff's station, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the sheriff was involved in Lila's death in some way. But he didn't have enough evidence yet to make an arrest. He needed to gather more information. The next step was to speak with Clara, Lila's mother. Thomas had already learned that Clara had been involved with the sheriff in a more personal way, and he was sure she knew more than she was letting on. He had to tread carefully. If Clara was involved, she might be just as dangerous as the sheriff. Clara lived in a small house on the edge of town, a modest place with overgrown grass and peeling paint. As Thomas approached the door, he took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he might uncover. When Clara opened the door, she looked surprised, but she quickly masked her emotions with a smile. Detective Thomas, she said, her voice sweet but with a hint of nervousness. What brings you here? I need to ask you some questions about your daughter, Thomas said, his tone serious. About what happened the night she died. Clara's face paled. She stepped back, allowing him inside. I've already spoken to the police, detective. I told them everything I know. I'm sure you have, Thomas said, taking a seat. But there's more to Lila's death than you're letting on. I need you to be honest with me, Clara. Were you aware of what was going on between your daughter and the sheriff? Clara's eyes widened, and she quickly glanced away, avoiding his gaze. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice shaky. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Clara, we both know you're lying. You knew exactly what was happening, didn't you? Clara broke down in tears, her hands shaking. Detective Thomas sat at his desk, the weight of the confession weighing heavily on his shoulders. Clara's admission that she had sold her daughter to Sheriff Mitchell was a shocking revelation, but it wasn't enough to secure an arrest. He still needed more concrete evidence to link the sheriff to Lila's death, and the truth was still buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. The case was far from over. He spent the following days reviewing the evidence, retracing Lila's last known movements, and going through every detail of Clara's confession. The bruises on Lila's neck, the strange absence of footprints at the scene, and the inconsistencies in the sheriff's statements all pointed to something much darker than a tragic accident. It was clear to Thomas that Sheriff Mitchell was hiding something, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out what it was. Thomas knew that the sheriff had a history of controlling those around him, and Clara's desperate need for approval and status had made her an easy target. But the more Thomas thought about it, the more questions he had about the sheriff's involvement in Lila's death. Was he simply using Clara and her daughter as pawns in his twisted game, or had he been directly involved in the murder? He decided to dig deeper into the sheriff's background, starting with his past relationships and any history of misconduct. Thomas had a feeling that the sheriff's charm was nothing but a facade, a tool he used to manipulate others. It was time to peel back the layers and see what lay beneath. Late that night, Thomas sat in front of his computer, scrolling through old police records, newspaper clippings, and anything else he could find about Sheriff Mitchell. After hours of searching, he came across something that caught his eye, a case from another small town, one that had been eerily similar to Lila's death. In the case, a young woman had been found dead in the woods, her body in a position that suggested she had been placed there, just like Lila. The circumstances surrounding her death were never fully explained, but there were rumors about the involvement of a man with significant power in the town, a man who had been described as charming, yet sinister. The name of the man was Sheriff Mitchell. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't the first time the sheriff had been connected to a death like this. It wasn't just a coincidence. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he needed more proof. He called up his colleague, Officer Sarah Davis, a seasoned investigator who had worked on high-profile cases before. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency, "I need you to check out Sheriff Mitchell's financial records. I have a feeling there's something more to this man than what we're seeing on the surface." "I'm on it, Thomas," Sarah replied. "I'll dig into his bank accounts, connections, anything that might give us a lead." The next morning, Thomas headed to the coroner's office to speak with Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the medical examiner who had conducted the autopsy on Lila's body. Dr. Hayes had been very thorough in her examination, but Thomas needed her to look at the case with fresh eyes. "Dr. Hayes, can you go over the details of Lila's autopsy again?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but insistent. "Something doesn't sit right with me about her injuries." Dr. Hayes nodded and opened Lila's file. She began reading through the details, her finger tracing the notes on the page. "Lila had bruising around her neck," she said slowly. "But what's unusual is that the bruises were inconsistent with a fall. They're more consistent with strangulation or choking." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "Are you saying she was strangled?" Dr. Hayes paused before responding, her eyes meeting Thomas's with a look of quiet certainty. "It's hard to say for sure without further investigation, but the bruising around the neck doesn't match the initial report of a fall. It's possible she was strangled before being left in the woods." Thomas stood up, his mind racing. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. If Lila had been strangled, it meant that her death was no accident. It was murder. And the fact that the sheriff had lied about the cause of death made him the prime suspect. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," Thomas said, his voice tight with determination. "I'll need a full report as soon as possible." As Thomas left the coroner's office, his phone rang. It was Officer Sarah Davis. "Thomas, I've got something. The sheriff's financial records show a number of large, unexplained transactions. Most of them are from an offshore account, but there's one that stands out. Payments to Clara for services rendered. It's all dated around the time Lila started spending more time with the sheriff." Thomas's mind raced. This was it. The smoking gun. Clara had been paid for her daughter, and the sheriff had been using his power to manipulate her. Detective Thomas stood in front of the sheriff's station, watching as Sheriff Mitchell walked out of the building, his broad shoulders carrying a sense of calm that belied the storm swirling around him. Thomas's grip tightened on his notepad as he watched the man, every instinct in him screaming that Mitchell was hiding something much more sinister than anyone had imagined. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but Thomas couldn't afford to make a move until he was absolutely certain. The investigation was getting deeper, and every new lead pointed to the same dark conclusion. Sheriff Mitchell was far more involved in Lila's death than just being a passive participant. The way he had controlled Clara, used her, and manipulated the girl, everything about the case screamed that Mitchell had orchestrated Lila's tragic end. Thomas sat down at his desk, going over the details again. Clara had confirmed that she was paid by Mitchell around the time Lila began seeing him. There were large sums of money being transferred from an offshore account, a clear sign that Mitchell had been preparing for something. But what? And when did Clara start to notice that things were going too far? He needed to dig into Clara's past, to figure out how deep this web ran. If there were any more hidden connections, he would find them. He also needed to take a closer look at Clara's movements and any contacts she might have had during the weeks leading up to Lila's death. Every step had to be traced, no matter how small. That evening, Thomas met with Officer Sarah Davis to go over the new developments. Sarah had managed to pull some strings and had obtained access to Clara's phone records. They were hoping to find something that would reveal who Clara had been talking to in the weeks before Lila's death. "I've cross-referenced her calls and texts," Sarah said as she spread the records across the table. "The most interesting thing is a series of messages between Clara and an unknown number. The messages were sent around the same time she was meeting with the sheriff. The language is very cryptic, but it's clear these weren't casual conversations." "Do we know who the unknown number belongs to?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. Sarah nodded. "I had the number traced. It came back to a private number, but there's an address tied to it, a cabin just outside of town. It's been rented for the last few months." Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline. This could be the break they needed. He didn't hesitate. "Get the address. We're going there now." They arrived at the cabin just before dusk, the long shadows stretching across the overgrown path that led to the front door. The cabin itself was tucked away behind a thick line of trees, hidden from view, but it had an eerie, deserted look to it. Thomas's gut told him something wasn't right. The area was too quiet, too still. "Let's check the perimeter first," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. They circled the cabin cautiously, searching for any sign of life. As they rounded the back of the building, they spotted something strange: fresh tire tracks in the mud. Someone had been here recently, and judging by the speed with which the tracks faded, they had left in a hurry. Thomas approached the door, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered gun. With a deep breath, he knocked, but there was no answer. He motioned for Sarah to stand back as he tested the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, as if the cabin had been abandoned for some time. The faint smell of old wood and dampness hung in the air. The living room was sparsely furnished, with a few chairs, a small coffee table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in months. Nothing unusual, but it didn't sit right with Thomas. He moved further into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room. Then he saw it, a stack of papers on the coffee table. The top sheet caught his attention. It was a handwritten note, but not from Clara. The writing was sharp, deliberate, and unmistakable. It read, "I'll handle her. Don't worry, this will be over soon." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The note was addressed to someone, and it confirmed what he had suspected. This was more than just an illicit affair. The sheriff had planned something far darker, and Clara was likely involved in the conspiracy. But who else was part of this? Who was the other person that Clara had been communicating with? Was it another accomplice, or someone who had been keeping tabs on the whole situation? Sarah noticed something else as she rifled through a drawer in the corner. She pulled out a series of photographs of Lila, some of them showing her in various stages of distress. There were pictures of her at school, in the woods, and a few that were clearly taken without her knowledge. It was unsettling. "These are surveillance photos," Sarah said, her voice tense. "Someone's been keeping track of her." Thomas's mind raced as he processed this new information. Detective Thomas paced in his office, his mind racing. The more he dug into the web of deceit surrounding Lila's death, the more he realized just how deeply intertwined Sheriff Mitchell and Clara were in this tragic event. He had been right to trust his instincts. This wasn't just about a young girl's life being taken. It was about power, manipulation, and betrayal. But there were still so many unanswered questions. He knew that the final piece of the puzzle lay with Clara. After their visit to the cabin, Thomas and Sarah had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to confront Clara again. The photos, the messages, and the cryptic note pointed directly to her complicity in the situation. But there was still one thing missing: a confession. It was time to bring Clara in for questioning, to push her to finally reveal the whole truth. Thomas couldn't wait any longer. The case was spiraling, and every minute counted. The next morning, Thomas arrived at Clara's home. It was a cold, gray day, the kind of weather that matched the heaviness in his chest. He wasn't looking forward to this confrontation, but he knew it was necessary. The truth needed to come out, for Lila, for justice, and for the town that had been living under the sheriff's shadow for far too long. Clara was at the kitchen table when Thomas entered her home. She looked up, startled, but quickly masking her surprise with a weak smile. There were dark circles under her eyes, evidence of the sleepless nights she'd been having since Lila's death. "Detective Thomas," Clara said, her voice trembling. "What brings you here today?" "We need to talk," Thomas replied, his voice steady but firm. He could see the panic flicker in her eyes, but he wasn't about to let her wiggle out of this. "I've seen the photos, Clara. I know you were involved with the sheriff, and I know you knew what was happening to your daughter." Clara's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it. She glanced toward the window as if seeking a way out. But Thomas could see she knew it was over. She couldn't hide anymore. Not from him, not from the truth. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The words felt hollow, rehearsed. It was clear she had been expecting this. "I'm not here to play games, Clara," Thomas said. "I have proof. I know about the payments the sheriff made to you. I know about the messages. I know you've been helping him all along. You sold your daughter, didn't you? You put her in a position where she had no way out." Clara shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what else to do. He promised me a better life. He promised me everything. I thought if I did what he wanted, maybe he'd help us. Help me." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes softening, but his voice was still firm. "You didn't protect your daughter, Clara. You let her become a pawn in his game. You sold her to the sheriff, and you knew what he wanted from her." Clara broke down, her sobs racking her body. She buried her face in her hands, unable to look Thomas in the eye. "I never meant for it to end like this. I never wanted her to die. I thought, if I just played along, he'd leave us alone. But it kept getting worse. And when Lila started fighting back, I couldn't stop him. I couldn't stop any of it." Thomas took a deep breath, letting the weight of her confession sink in. He'd known Clara had been involved, but hearing her finally admit it made everything feel too real. The fear, the guilt, the desperation in her voice. It was clear that Clara was as much a victim in all of this as Lila had been. But that didn't excuse her actions. She had willingly handed her daughter over to a monster, and now her daughter was dead. "I need you to tell me everything, Clara," Thomas said. "How did it all start? What happened the night Lila died?" Clara looked up, her eyes bloodshot and filled with regret. She wiped her tears away, trying to gather herself. "It started when Mitchell came to me, asking for favors. He said he could help me if I helped him. He told me he wanted Lila to be with him. He said he could give her a life she could never have with me. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to sell her out, but I was desperate. I thought maybe it would keep us safe, keep us out of trouble." Thomas nodded, silently urging her to continue. "Lila didn't like it. She hated him from the start. She tried to resist. But Mitchell, he had ways of getting what he wanted. He threatened to expose my past, my mistakes. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't comply. And when Lila started fighting him, when she threatened to tell the truth, that's when I couldn't protect her anymore. I didn't know what to do, so I let him take her." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper now, as if speaking the words was too much to bear. Detective Thomas sat at his desk, the weight of Clara's confession still heavy on his shoulders. Everything was in place now. The photos, the messages, the bank transactions, and most importantly, Clara's sworn statement. They had what they needed to bring Sheriff Mitchell to justice. But Thomas knew that the real work was just beginning. This wasn't going to be an easy arrest. The sheriff held power in the town, and he had his own way of manipulating people. It would take more than just evidence to bring him down. It would take precision, strategy, and nerve. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the office as Thomas sat with Sarah and a few other officers, going over the final details of their plan. The sheriff's cabin in the woods had been linked to several suspicious activities over the years, but no one had ever dared to fully investigate him until now. "Mitchell's not going to go down without a fight," Sarah said, looking over the case files. "We need to be prepared for anything." Thomas nodded. "We have everything we need to make this stick. Clara's testimony, the financial records, the photos. He's as good as caught, but we'll have to be careful. Mitchell will use his connections to turn this around if we're not thorough. The plan was simple. They would arrest Sheriff Mitchell at his office, in broad daylight, when he least expected it. The team would be ready to handle any backup he might have in the station, ensuring there would be no chance for him to escape or retaliate. Before they made their move, Thomas needed to confirm one last thing. Clara had told him about the night of Lila's death, how Mitchell had strangled her, but there were still doubts. Was there a physical trace of Mitchell's involvement that would solidify the case in court? It was time to get the coroner involved again. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes met with Thomas privately in her office later that day. She had already performed Lila's autopsy, but after Clara's confession, Thomas wanted to be sure. He needed confirmation that Lila's cause of death had been asphyxiation, not just an accident. Dr. Hayes, Thomas began, sitting down across from her, I need you to look at Lila's body again. I know we've gone over it, but I need a more detailed analysis. Clara said Mitchell strangled her, and I need to know if that matches the evidence. Dr. Hayes gave him a sympathetic look. I've already told you the cause of death was strangulation, but I can go over the details again. You're right. It's important to have all our bases covered. She opened Lila's file and reviewed the autopsy report. The bruising around the neck is consistent with manual strangulation. There are clear signs of pressure applied to the throat, and there was no evidence of a fall. The trauma matches what Clara described. Lila was likely conscious at the time it happened. It's clear now. Lila didn't die by accident. She was murdered. Thomas nodded, his heart sinking with the finality of her words. This wasn't just an accidental death. It was murder. Cold, calculated, and executed by the very man who was supposed to protect the town. Mitchell had taken a life to protect his own twisted desires, and now there was no escaping the truth. With the confirmation they needed, the plan was set in motion. By noon, the team was in position, surrounding the sheriff's office. Thomas stood just outside, watching as Sheriff Mitchell went about his business inside, oblivious to the storm coming his way. The arrest would be swift and decisive, but Thomas's mind kept racing. What would happen once Mitchell was in custody? The man had years of corruption behind him. There would be a trial, but who could say how far Mitchell's influence would reach? Thomas's thoughts were interrupted by a call from Sarah. We've got eyes on Mitchell, Sarah said, her voice calm but urgent. He's just left his office. We're ready when you are. Thomas took a deep breath, signaling to his team. It was time. They moved in quickly, surrounding the sheriff as he stepped out of his car, his usual cocky smile fading as he saw the officers approach him. Sheriff Mitchell, you're under arrest for the murder of Lila Hayes, Thomas said, his voice clear and firm. Mitchell's expression changed immediately, his face tightening with anger. What is this nonsense, he spat. I haven't done anything. You can't arrest me. You're not above the law, Thomas replied, stepping forward to handcuff him. You've been under investigation for some time now. We have enough evidence to charge you with murder. Your role in Lila's death is undeniable. Mitchell struggled briefly, but the officers quickly restrained him. He was being led to the squad car when he glared at Thomas, his voice low with venom. You'll regret this, detective. I've got more power than you could ever imagine. You'll never make it out of this town. Thomas ignored the threat. He'd heard it all before. But this time, there was no getting out of it. They had him now, and he wasn't going anywhere. As Mitchell was placed in the back of the squad car, Thomas took a moment to look around. The town had been living under the sheriff's influence for far too long, but things were about to change. The veil of fear and manipulation that Mitchell had cast over the town was starting to lift. Back at the station, Thomas sat down with his team, a sense of relief slowly settling over him. The arrest was the first step toward justice for Lila, but there was still a long road ahead. The trial, the investigation into Mitchell's corrupt activities, and the fallout from the truth coming to light would all take time. But for now, Thomas could finally breathe a little easier. They had taken the sheriff down, they had taken away his power, and, most importantly, they had brought Lila the justice she deserved. Good job, everyone, Thomas said, standing up from his chair. This isn't over, but we're one step closer to making sure nothing like this ever happens again. As he left the station, he couldn't help but think of Lila, her courage, her fight for freedom, even in the face of such darkness. Her death had sparked a chain of events that had led to the fall of a corrupt system. And though she was gone, her story would be heard. Justice had been served.